This is what happens when ministers go back to school. The minister has to take a class about Thomas Merton. You get to hear about Thomas Merton. As many of you know, Merton was an unusually famous Catholic monk who was prominent from the 1940s through the 1960s. He probably would not have been my first choice of a theologian to spend an entire semester on, but as my classmates and I read some 1,400 pages by and about him, it turned out that he and I have more in common than I expected. We both have prolific journal writing habits and strong interests in racial justice. We share a love of the contradictory interests of socializing and solitude. And of course, we both felt the call to the life of a religious professional. We also had conversion experiences at exactly the same age. Merton became Catholic at age 23. I grew up Catholic and became Unitarian Universalist at age 23, right here at First Church. And even before I enrolled in the Merton class, I'd long appreciated his story of his epiphany at 4th and Walnut, which Nancy just wonderfully read for us. That story resonates because I've experienced a version of that feeling, of looking around at people I don't know and having a great love for them, of realizing that we are all connected, and seeing my fellow human beings as shining like the sun. Merton had his epiphany when he was in his early 40s, and I was in my early 40s when I first heard about it. That was back when I was in my first round of seminary, in the middle of the Obama years, when the world certainly wasn't perfect, but when it seemed easier to believe that famous quote about the moral arc of the universe bending toward justice. Back in 2012, right after voters in Minnesota made it the first state to reject a ban on same-sex marriage, my heart was full. I remember being in Target and wanting to give hugs to the other shoppers just to thank them. I did not follow through on that urge because I have good boundaries. But I was just so grateful that a majority of voters had made the ethical, life-affirming, love-affirming choice. These days, here in 2025, I'll admit that I'm more than a bit worried that my great love for humanity may have peaked years ago. It seems that people, or maybe just too many people in this country, have gotten harder to love. As those of us paying attention know, too many of our fellow citizens are choosing separateness, supremacy, and superiority, even as more and more of us are becoming aware of the consequences of the greed, the corruption, and the culture of death that have followed. For those of us who have functioning, compassionate hearts, for those of us who put love at the center, these are not easy times. And there seems to be a lack of light at the end of the tunnel. Some days the tunnel seems to be getting longer. This can make it even harder to want to keep on trying to chug forward. Your worship theme this month here at the First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee is becoming. And in these times, each of us is facing important questions every day. Questions like, who am I becoming? And who will I become? These questions are worth exploring in the context of the bigger we of community and the smaller we of our individual lives. The world and its events present a powerful combination of forces that have the potential to change us more than we change them. That means it's so important to be mindful of what our practices are and what we let into our hearts and what self-change will look like over the long term. Among the practices I'd like to touch on are the practices of prayer, meditation, and centering our attention. This is something that we do every week here in worship, but that you may be less likely to do on your own. And so I want to briefly offer up an oldie but a goodie from the annals of prayer. It's known most commonly as the Serenity Prayer, and it's typically attributed to American theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. Its actual origins are more complicated, but I will leave that to you and Google if you are interested. The version that most of us know goes like this. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. One of the things that's great about this prayer is that it can be easily adapted into a non-theistic or secular version. Instead of asking God to grant the serenity, one can simply express it as a hope. May I find the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. It's a prayer available to all. What's maybe a little bit unfortunate is that this prayer sometimes feels overexposed. It was on a lot of coffee mugs for a while. It also gets pigeonholed as a prayer for people in recovery, or a prayer that's about personal individual problems. And frankly, right now, serenity may be too much to ask for. But for many of us, discerning what we can and cannot change feels like a daily task. And taking a moment to acknowledge that challenge can be a wise practice. Another related practice is to remember that you personally are not responsible for saving the world or the country by yourself. I imagine that kind of feeling may be why some of you are here today, to be embraced and surrounded and supported by community. We are experiencing week after week of hard news events that you might first hear about when you are alone, perhaps via your phone. Such isolation can make it easier to veer toward fear and hopelessness, and what's the point? This is one of the ways the world can change us if we aren't careful. And the oligarchs in charge would love it if we gave up. We don't come to church to prove our piousness. We come because staying engaged in community is a sustaining and life-giving practice. Part of accepting what we cannot change is being able to accept the immediate past. Grave damage has been done these past 7 months, and some of it cannot be undone. The harm to countless individuals, to medical research, to institutions committed to education and the common good. For years now, my mantra about the challenges to our democracy has been, it's not too late. Helpful as that has been, it is not as true as it once was. It is in fact too late to prevent some of the damage in this country and around the world. And that means there is much grief for us to carry here in 2025. It is spiritual work to live with, live into, and live beyond that grief. As always during tough times, I try to center and learn from the voices of the marginalized. And one of the voices I've been listening to the past couple of weeks is that of the Reverend Joseph Santos Lyons, an American UU minister of Chinese and Czech heritage who serves in the Pacific Northwest. In a series of recent posts, he beautifully names the grief and heartbreak of these times. Maybe it's only now sinking in, he writes. The future we imagined is no longer available. And there is no past golden time any of us can or should want to return to. Reverend Santos Lyons points to his need to adapt. I'm reflecting on my capacity to shift, he says, to meet these times not just with strategy, but with soul. How do I become more flexible, more rooted, and more courageous? Reverend Santos Lyons is among those who are encouraging us to look for and take part in smaller forms of change. This may seem counterintuitive given the scale and scope of all that's going on. But in many ways, big has been failing us. Large corporations and universities, and certainly the institution known as Congress, are showing us what complicity looks like. By contrast, the Reverend Santos Lyons describes those individuals focused on small change as quiet generators of liberation. He says they tend to the sacred small things, relationships, time, space, spirit. There are people out there, he says, maybe right next to you, who are living into the world we long for. They are tending to it like a garden, quietly, persistently. He reminds us that keeping an eye on the big while working on the small is one way to change the things we can. Now, this may require some spiritual work, some humility, to accept that our actions might feel small. I'm reminded of a meme that I recently saw that made me chuckle ruefully. It said something like, "Woman recycles yogurt cup as 93 private jets arrive for Bezos' wedding." Doing a small act in the face of large-scale assaults on our climate may feel like pointless piety, but the practice still matters. The reality is that there is a huge garbage mountain just northwest of here, right near where I grew up. It's hundreds of feet tall now and a mile long. Every bottle or piece of paper or scrap of metal that's kept out of there still matters to those neighbors and to the generations to come. Practices that feel small are still of value and can serve as reminders of the importance of working for larger systemic changes. Call it discernment, call it triage, call it the wisdom to know the difference. Deciding how to live in these times is work that we are called to do. And as the writer and activist Rebecca Solnit began reminding us last November, the fact that we cannot save everything does not mean that we cannot save anything, and everything we can save is worth saving. How we go about doing that saving may require us to shift some of our thoughts and tactics. I'm in general agreement with the theologian Richard Rohr when he says, "The best criticism of the bad is the practice of the better." But sometimes the practice of the better isn't enough. Take the humanity-denying practice of gerrymandering, for example. Noble stances against it have been taken to try to uphold democracy. But because not everyone is choosing to be noble, understatement of the morning, democracy is suffering. So I am grateful, even though I'm not quite glad, that defenders of democracy are now indicating a willingness to take extraordinary measures, to play offense in order to try to bring about fair electoral outcomes. What's going on now is messy and less than ideal, but seems necessary to live our ideals. Another area of action that may be getting more complicated is public protest, something this congregation has been providing amazing leadership on. Every time I see Reverend Jennifer show up on my screen, I let out a cheer for the essential witness of this congregation. There is a push right now at the highest levels of government to make everything about public life more militarized and more confrontational. We can preserve our nonviolent ethic, but we may need to change what level of risk we are willing to take in order to keep showing up for our values. The overarching narrative of rising fascism can make it a bit tricky to talk about things like gratitude and hope and joy, but these remain valid and essential practices for these times. Now, the idea is not to go around grinning toward an apocalypse, but it is good to note that joy is not always the most appropriate or relatable emotion. Even before the current slew of calamities, our brutal economic system of haves and have-nots and our culture of extreme individualism were leaving so many people struggling and alone. Our country recently set a new low on the happiness index, and it is not surprising if you've been paying attention. So whenever we think of sharing our feelings of joy, gratitude, and hope, it's important to read the room. Figure out who's ready and able to be joyful, to understand where people are at and what kind of approach might someday be able to bring them along. And it's helpful to remember that joy is still possible even under oppressive conditions. Think of all the ways that black joy shows up in our world, or the joy of a pride festival. Communities with seemingly fewer reasons to be joyful still find a way and offer examples to the wider culture. As for gratitude, I know that I'm finding it less elusive than I might have expected. The world's deepening shadows can somehow make the bright spots seem brighter. I find myself treasuring whatever there is that can be treasured in a given moment. When our broken climate can go a whole day without throwing wildfire smoke or flooding at us, that day feels like a gift. The chance to be in spaces like this one, creating beauty and community and centering love, also a huge gift. And while the oligarchs and lackeys get too much of our attention, there are plenty of other people to focus on and be grateful for. I give abundant thanks to the rebels and the resistors who are writing and truth-telling, creating satire and protesting, with a special shout out to some travelers from Texas currently hiding out in Illinois. Even as the facts of history are under fire, history ultimately will remember who was on the side of equity and justice. And hope? Well, I've spoken here before about the importance of viewing hope as a mindset and a way of being rather than a feeling. I've shared with you the work of beloved and recently departed Joanna Macy, her concept of active hope. Today I want to offer a variation on that. It's a quote from Václav Havel, who wrote it while he was jailed for promoting democracy in the old Czechoslovakia. He wrote this: "Hope," he wrote, "is an orientation of the spirit, an orientation of the heart. It transcends the world that is immediately experienced and is anchored somewhere beyond its horizons. Hope, in this deep and powerful sense, is not the same as joy that things are going well, or willingness to invest in enterprises that are obviously headed for early success. Rather, it's an ability to work for something because it is good, not just because it stands a chance to succeed." Before his long journey of fighting oppression and becoming president of his liberated nation, Havel was a poet and a playwright. His unlikely seeming ascent serves as a reminder of how stories and the arts have a role to play in determining a country's future. And so I want to offer you one more story, a story from a theater. The week before last, I got a last-minute ticket to attend a production of Cabaret. As many of you know, the show is set in Germany in the early 1930s, a place and time with an unfortunate number of similarities to the present-day United States. When the show's book was first created, it was regarded as a reminder of a piece of history rather than as a relevant cautionary tale. Today, its story of the rise of Nazis and the extinguishing of anyone outside the approval of white Christian nationalists resonates profoundly. I found myself forgetting to breathe during much of the second act. So real did it all seem. And at the end of the show, as boxcar doors slammed and trains headed to camps, the 1,000 audience members in the packed house sat completely still in a heightened, exhausted silence. There was too little distance between the play and real life for applause. We had collectively borne witness to evil. And we came out the other side. We roared back to life for a prolonged standing ovation, not just for the quality of the performances, but also for the fact that this production had bravely taken place at all in a time of government censorship, self-censorship, and retreat from historical reality. There were so many reasons to cheer. And as we stood and clapped, as I looked around at the cast and the audience, looked up and down the aisles of all those people, one thing was true. There were no strangers. I was theirs, and they were mine. The applause finally ran its course, and we filed back into the world, newly determined and shining like the sun. Amen.